In this episode, we take the next logical step after functional analysis and allocation, turning security requirements into concrete security design components that engineers can build, review, and validate without constantly reinterpreting intent. A security design component is a purposeful piece of the system's design that exists to satisfy one or more security requirements, such as a mechanism for verifying identity, a consistent way to enforce authorization, a protected method for storing secrets, or an approach for capturing audit evidence. Beginners sometimes imagine that security is mainly about sprinkling protections throughout the system, like adding checks wherever problems appear, but that approach tends to create inconsistency and gaps. When security is built as intentional components, the system's protective behavior becomes more predictable, easier to test, and easier to maintain as features change. The phrase map cleanly to requirements means you can point from a requirement to the component that fulfills it, and you can explain how the component accomplishes that requirement at a high level. Our goal is to show how you choose and shape security components so they support clarity, separation, and validation, while avoiding the trap of complicated, overlapping controls that are hard to reason about. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong starting point is to remember why mapping matters in the first place. If a requirement exists but no component is clearly responsible for it, the requirement becomes a wish rather than a property of the system. If multiple components partially satisfy a requirement, you may end up with inconsistent enforcement, where one path is secure and another path quietly bypasses controls. If a component claims to satisfy a requirement, but its design is vague, engineers will implement it differently across the system, and reviewers will struggle to confirm whether it truly meets intent. Clean mapping creates a simple mental model. Requirements express what must be true, components express how the system makes it true, and validation confirms it stays true. This chain reduces confusion during design reviews, reduces rework late in the project, and reduces drift after deployment. It also helps incident response, because when something fails, you can identify which component is responsible for the protective behavior and investigate the right place. In security engineering, clarity is not cosmetic. It is how you reduce mistakes and improve trust in the system's behavior. Security design components usually begin with foundational components, because some security requirements are central to everything else. Identity and access control is a common foundation because many requirements depend on knowing who is making a request and whether they should be allowed to do it. A cleanly mapped identity component includes how identities are established, how sessions or tokens represent those identities, and how the system verifies that the identity is still valid. A cleanly mapped authorization component includes how permissions are represented, how ownership rules are enforced, and how high-impact actions are treated differently from routine actions. These components should be designed so they can be reused consistently, because inconsistent access control is one of the most common ways systems fail. Beginners sometimes think a login feature is enough, but login is only the beginning. Authorization decisions must be made throughout the system whenever data is accessed or actions are performed. When identity and authorization are treated as components rather than scattered logic, you can review them for completeness and ensure they apply uniformly. That uniformity is what makes mapping to requirements meaningful and dependable. Another category of security design components focuses on protecting data, and mapping here benefits from thinking in terms of data states: stored, processed, and moved. A component for protecting stored data includes not only encryption ideas, but also how access is restricted, how keys or secrets are handled, and how backups and replicas are treated. A component for protecting data movement includes how communications are secured, how endpoints are authenticated, and how the system prevents data from being sent to unintended destinations. A component for protecting data during processing includes how sensitive operations are isolated, how outputs are minimized, and how errors are handled so they do not leak details or bypass checks. Clean mapping means a requirement like protect sensitive data in transit is not vaguely implemented in some places and forgotten in others. Instead, it is addressed by a movement protection component that is applied wherever data crosses defined boundaries. Similarly, a requirement like prevent unauthorized modification is not left to hope. It is addressed by integrity-oriented design elements, such as validation and protected audit trails. When you frame data protection as components, you make it easier to cover all paths and reduce the chance that a forgotten data flow becomes the attacker's easiest path. Audit and accountability are another area where component thinking prevents common failures. Many requirement sets include statements about logging, monitoring, and traceability, but teams sometimes implement these as an afterthought, resulting in incomplete or inconsistent evidence. A clean audit component defines what events must be captured, what details are necessary to reconstruct actions, how logs are protected from alteration, and how logs can remain available even during partial failures. It also defines how identities are linked to actions, so you can attribute changes to the right actor, whether human or automated. This component should map directly to requirements about accountability and incident investigation, and it should be designed as a reliable source of truth, not a scattered collection of debug statements. Beginners may think logging is mainly for troubleshooting, but in security it is also a control because it deters misuse and supports detection. If audit evidence can be erased or forged easily, the system loses a key layer of defense. A well-designed audit component, clearly mapped to requirements, ensures that accountability is built into normal operation rather than improvised after an incident. Security design components also include resilience and recovery elements, because many requirements implicitly depend on the system behaving safely during failures. A recovery component maps to requirements about availability, integrity preservation, and controlled restoration, making sure the system can recover without introducing new security gaps. This includes how backups are created, protected, and restored, how corrupted data is detected, and how the system returns to a trusted state after disruption. A resilience component also includes safe degradation behaviors, such as what the system does if an identity service is unavailable or if a critical dependency fails. Clean mapping is especially important here because resilience features are often built under time pressure, and if they are not mapped to explicit requirements, they may become insecure shortcuts. For example, a rushed fallback mode might disable checks to keep the system working, but that can turn an outage into a breach. When resilience is treated as a component with clear requirements, fallback behaviors can be designed intentionally and validated, reducing the chance that emergency operation undermines security. In security engineering, the ability to recover safely is part of the security story, not an optional convenience. A key discipline when developing components is to avoid building components that are too broad or too tangled, because tangled components create unclear responsibility and weaken mapping. If one component tries to handle authentication, authorization, session management, and auditing all together without clear boundaries, it becomes difficult to verify which requirement it satisfies and how. It also becomes harder to change one aspect without accidentally affecting others. Component design benefits from separation, where each component has a clear purpose and clear interfaces, and other parts of the system interact with it in consistent ways. This separation does not require a complicated architecture. It requires clarity about responsibilities and control points. Clean mapping often means a component satisfies a coherent group of requirements that naturally fit together, such as identity verification requirements and session integrity requirements. When requirements do not naturally fit together, they should not be forced into the same component, because that creates confusing coupling. A beginner-friendly way to judge this is to ask whether you can describe what the component does in one clear sentence and still capture its core purpose. Component mapping also supports traceability in both directions, which is essential for maintaining security over time. If you start from a requirement, you should be able to find the component that fulfills it and understand how it is implemented. If you start from a component, you should be able to list which requirements depend on it, so changes to the component can be evaluated for downstream impact. This is particularly important when systems evolve, because new features may introduce new paths that must use the same components, and changes to a component may unintentionally weaken protections across multiple features. Clean mapping helps prevent regression, where a change breaks a security property that was previously satisfied. It also helps prevent duplication, where different teams build their own versions of the same security function, leading to inconsistent behavior. When components are reusable and mapping is clear, the system's security posture becomes more stable as it grows. Stability is a major objective of security engineering because unstable security leads to surprises. Another important aspect of clean component mapping is making validation straightforward. A component that is meant to satisfy a requirement should have clear observable behavior that can be tested or inspected. For example, an authorization component should consistently deny actions that exceed permissions, and those denials should be visible in audit evidence. A data protection component should demonstrate that sensitive data is not stored in plain text where it should not be, and that data movement uses protected channels at defined boundaries. An audit component should demonstrate that logs are complete for required events and protected against tampering. Validation is much harder when security is implemented as scattered checks, because you cannot easily know whether every path is covered. With components, you can validate the component itself and then validate that system paths use the component consistently. This is one of the most practical reasons to design security as components rather than as scattered code changes. For beginners, it is helpful to see that good design makes testing easier, and easier testing makes security more trustworthy. Beginners sometimes worry that designing components sounds like over-engineering, but the goal is not to add complexity. It is to organize complexity that already exists. Every system that enforces access control has an access control mechanism, even if it is informal and inconsistent. Every system that logs events has a logging method, even if it is incomplete. By making these mechanisms explicit components, you make them reviewable and improvable. This tends to reduce complexity in the long run because it discourages ad hoc exceptions and scattered logic. It also supports economy of mechanism, because component design encourages you to implement security controls in a simple, consistent way rather than creating many special cases. Clean mapping to requirements is what keeps component design grounded, ensuring you build components because they satisfy real needs, not because they sound sophisticated. When mapping is done well, you can justify each component in terms of the requirements it supports and the risks it reduces. That justification helps keep the design practical and focused. As you bring this lesson to a close, the main idea is that security design components are the pieces of a system that embody security requirements in a concrete, consistent way. When components map cleanly to requirements, you can trace security intent into the design, allocate responsibilities clearly, and validate behavior without constant debate about interpretation. Foundational components for identity, authorization, data protection, audit evidence, and resilient recovery form the backbone of a trustworthy system, while separation and simplicity keep those components understandable and hard to bypass. Clean mapping also supports change over time by showing which requirements depend on which components, reducing the chance that updates break security properties silently. For beginners, the habit to cultivate is to ask, for each requirement, what component or mechanism makes this true, and how will we know it remains true as the system changes? That question turns security from a list of rules into a system of design behaviors, which is exactly the direction security engineering is meant to go.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.